the federal government interpreted that request to be?
I can say quite authoritatively, I believe it was not assumed to be law enforcement because everybody understood the Article 9 process very well. It's been used many times over the years. So this was inferred to be armed forces personnel.
Okay, thank you. And we do know, of course, that there was a request for deployment of RCMP officers that was appropriately made under the police services agreement. That came just a few days later, correct?
Correct.
All right, now can we please take a look at document pb.can.401514? And this is an email from Mr. Dakelbab to yourself on February 13. And it outlines a meeting that Transportation Canada individuals had with colleagues from Alberta, Manitoba, and Ontario. And if we scroll down to the bullet points that begin with Alberta, we can see those there. Alberta requests for CAF support have been denied, but they are surprised that the request to access reservists with operational skills needed to drive towing trucks was not accepted. This part of the request is news to us, and we committed to follow up on this specific point. Do you know if there was any follow-up on that point?
I do not.
All right. Now, ultimately, the Government of Canada was going to deny Alberta's request for assistance, correct?
Actually, what happened was that we evaluated the initial request and determined that the CAF equipment would not be appropriate. And as this indicates, it was not my understanding that there was another dimension to the personnel request. However, we did not formally notify Alberta that the RFA would be turned down on the basis of the fact that we were still having discussions about the federal toolkit and ultimately addressed the tow truck issue via the Emergencies Act.
Okay, now I'd like to take you to some draft letters that were in Canada's production for this, beginning with pb.nsc.can 409547. We can see that this is dated February 7th. It's addressed to the Honourable Minister McIver, which is the Minister of Municipal Affairs for Alberta. And if we scroll down to the last paragraph on the first page, it says, further, I understand that Alberta has the required authorities necessary to enforce compliance as a highway is considered essential infrastructure, and it is unlawful to willfully obstruct, interrupt, or interfere with the construction, maintenance, use, or operation of any essential infrastructure in a manner that renders the essential infrastructure dangerous, useless, inoperative, or ineffective as per the Critical Infrastructure Defence Act of Alberta. And this letter is unsigned. Do you know why it was unsigned and unsent at this time?
For the reasons I just explained.
Okay, but you would agree that on February 7th, the Government of Canada's position was that Alberta had the required authorities to deal with the illegal protests around Coutts, Alberta?
We determined that the full suite of provincial tools had not been exhausted, which is sort of a first principle of the RFA. All right.
And then there are a number of other follow-up draft letters that contain essentially the same language in it. Just for the record, I will take you to ssm.can.nsc 402745. And this is a memorandum for the Minister of Emergency Preparedness. I understand if you scroll down to page 2 that you digitally signed this memorandum on February 9th. Do you see that?
I see that.
And in this memorandum, you recommended that the Minister of Emergency Preparedness sign an enclosed reply indicating that the Government of Canada was refusing the RFA.
Okay,
Is that correct?
I believe so. I haven't seen the attachment, but I believe so.
Well, and the enclosed correspondence on this one is actually redacted. But if we look at the body of the memorandum, we see the reasons for refusing. On page 2, the paragraph above the heading recommendation says, this remains an issue within provincial jurisdiction. Alberta has the required legal authorities necessary to enforce compliance. So very similar reasons for the refusal that was being outlined in the February 7th draft, correct?
Correct.
And then if we turn now to ssm.nsc.can 403115, this is a series of emails from February 11th. And in the email from Ratty Barrack to Minister Bill Blair, it says, here is the latest draft in reply to Alberta's RFA. And again, going to page 2, we see a paragraph starting with further, I understand. And it says Alberta has the required legal authorities necessary to enforce compliance, and then refers to the Critical Infrastructure Defence Act. So again, here we are, February 11th, very similar reasons to those expressed on February 9th and February 7th, correct?
Correct.
And if we scroll to the very top of this, we see that Minister Blair approved the response. Were you aware that he had approved such a response?
I was.
Okay.
And I told a provincial official, although I cannot remember who that was.
Do you know the level of provincial official you told, or the meeting in which you told them that?
A deputy minister called me and asked if we were going to approve it sometime within 24 to 48 hours of the original request. And I said, my expectation is we would not.
Okay, so very early on, the decision was made it would be refused. The reasons for refusing it seem to not really have changed throughout the course of the time when the draft response was being considered. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
And then I'm going to take you to one last draft, and that is on pb.can.nsc. I believe it's 50690. And this is an email. My understanding is with the timestamp, this time is actually the true time that this was sent should be 5 hours ahead of this. So sometime in the evening on February 12th. Excuse me. If we scroll down to the second email there, and on the second page, we again see we've got a draft response. And again, the wording is very similar. Further, I understand Alberta has the required legal authorities, and then reference to the Critical Infrastructure Defence Act. So by as late as February 12th, the Government of Canada's position on Alberta's RFA was that it had the required legal authorities necessary to enforce compliance of any illegal protest activity occurring in Alberta. Do you agree?
It had powers to address the circumstance, including compelling tow truck drivers.
You're now well out of time.
Can I just have 1 minute to clarify which act that that power comes under, Mr. Commissioner?
Okay.
So, I'm sorry. You referred to Alberta having the power to compel tow truck operators under the Critical Infrastructure Defence Act. I'm going to put to you that that act is not actually the correct act. It is only 5 sections long, and the Commission has heard evidence from the Assistant Deputy Minister de Grand that that legislation makes interfering with critical infrastructure an offense, but it's not something that Alberta needs to invoke. Alberta does have the Emergency Management Act, which does grant in it the power to compel service providers to provide services. So despite maybe having a confusion about which act that power falls under, it doesn't change the position that Canada's response to Alberta's RFA. Would you agree?
I would agree.
Okay. Thank you. That's